Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this year's finals. Before the debate begins, it is my pleasure to welcome among us a Slovene member of the European Parliament and a dear friend of our school, Mr. Milan Brglez. Unfortunately, the Minister of Education, Science and Sport, Mr. Janez Pikalo, is unable to attend due to a previous engagement. I kindly invite Mr. Milan Brglez to say a few words to the debaters and their coaches.
Distinguished Headmaster of Gimnazija Franca Miklošiča Ljutomer, Mr. Zvonko Kustec, professors and students, dear debaters and mentors, other distinguished guests. I'm very pleased and honored to be able to greet you today in Ljutomer, just before the final debate, in which the two best teams will confront their arguments and excellent debating skills. The final debate is a peak of the tournament, and I would like to congratulate both teams for reaching it. Nevertheless, my congratulations go to all of you that participate in this event and promote debate in your home countries and internationally. I applaud your choice of debate as an activity and a way of life that chooses knowledge and argument over mere opinion, dialogue and plurality of ideas over monologue and monolith way of thinking. I have to admit, the topics that you have been debating in this tournament are not easy, neither to debate nor to judge on the winner of each debate. Some of these topics, for example, the role of Nato in the protection of international peace and security, produce very strong and opposing views among political parties and among the public. Others, such as precarious work, might lead to less disagreement at the pro and contra level, but to far more diverging views on the measures that should be taken to prevent exploitation of workers. Some topics are easier to grasp, while others, such as cybercurrencies, still present something new and something abstract, especially for older generations. But as you all well know, the key is not so much in the topic. The key of each debate lies in the arguments and the strategy of defending your arguments over the competing viewpoints of the opponent. As a political scientist and international lawyer, and despite or precisely because of my experience with national and European politics in the past 6 years, I still believe in the power of a good argument. It is essential to debate, to discuss, and to form different views. However, these views should always be based on arguments and facts, as opposed to opinions and what we today call alternative facts or fake news. Since populism has triumphed politics, both its right and left-wing spectrum, the politicians too often dismiss the importance of a good and solid argument and rely on slogans and empty words without questioning their meaning. The era of post-politics is an era of many answers but very few right questions. Politics and politicians claim to be closer to the people, but they do very little for the people. As we lack solutions for the key global challenges, it is becoming clear that we need to shift the core of politics from plain rhetoric to profound debate. My generation must start this difficult process immediately, but it will be yours to carry on the responsibility. This is why I'm very hopeful today, seeing you, a group of young people from different backgrounds, countries, and speaking different languages, engaging in exciting and competitive, but most importantly, respectful debate. Gaining confidence with the power of arguments rather than spreading fear with the argument of power should be the leading civilizational endeavor. That is what happened when a 15-year-old girl started protesting peacefully in front of the Swedish parliament in the summer of 2018, demanding action on the climate emergency with facts and arguments based on scientific evidence. Soon, millions of young people joined and demanded from politicians to start making decisions which, among others, resulted in the recent proposal for a climate law, a legally binding document at the EU level with historical relevance. It is thus extremely important for the civil society, and especially the younger individuals, to be critical, to declare and articulate dissatisfaction, and to engage constructively in public affairs. You have to remind us that this is the world you will be living in, and in the end, you and the future generations will have to carry the burden of not doing enough when we still had the time to do so. In politics, compromise is inevitable if we want to avoid deadlock and non-action. Nevertheless, it is crucial that we are being constantly reminded of the red lines of the principled positions, especially when it comes to protection of human rights, key principles of international law, environmental protection, and sustainable development. Your contribution is of a great importance as we try to strike a balance in Europe and in wider international community between green but also socially just societies, between security and personal safety, and many other challenges ahead of us. Dear debaters, thank you again for this opportunity to address you today. I wish you success in your future projects and endeavors, and I look forward to seeing you at other negotiating tables, leading by example and teaching others about the meaning and power of argumentation.
Before the debate starts, we also want to thank, in the name of the side of proposition, to some of our coaches. First, to our Matija Pushni coach, our beloved coach, who is very sadly in an operation. I hope he recovers. Yeah, that's it for Matija Pushnik. Then we want to thank Raya Debeut, who helped us through this tournament to achieve some general clarifications for our cases, which were in the beginning not that nuanced. And then I also want to thank Miha Andrić, who is from year 1, helping us with debate and helping us through organization stuff and stuff like that. And then we also want to thank Martin Gibert, who helped us for accompanying us here to this tournament. And lastly, we also want to thank the tournament itself, which provided such amazing croissants, and that's it. Thank you.
So before we start with the final of this tournament, I would like to welcome both teams, and I would like to introduce them to you very shortly. On the proposition side from Ljubljana, we have team Bejigrad A with Philip, Aniket, Jiva, and not speaking but still speaking, Hannah. Please congratulate them. And then on the opposition, all the way from Maribor, we have team DGM Magenta with Emmanuel, Mateusz, and Emma. So the motion for this final is this House would abolish NATO, and to open the debate on behalf of the proposition, we would like to give the floor to Philip. Good luck.
Honorable panel, dear audience, NATO is not only an abomination from the past, it is an active threat to world peace today. But about the threat, we recognize that the threat might exist currently or in the future. The question and the key comparative in this round is, which side? Either the side of the proposition, where we fundamentally support ACO coalitions, or the side of the opposition where you have a big military bloc such as NATO. Before we move on to the three constructives in which we shall prove to you why we need to abolish NATO, which will be first, that NATO is necessarily harmful, secondly, that eco-coalitions are better, and thirdly, how NATO polarizes the world, a bit of framing. We recognize that NATO is a North Atlantic Treaty Organization that combines 29 member states into a military alliance. There are two articles of importance there. The first is the Article 5, which talks about collective security, which means if one country gets attacked, all other countries respond. Article 10 is important because it talks about unanimous decision voting within organization of NATO as well as for all the other actions that NATO takes. What is the comparative in this round? We say to you that the comparative is the ad hoc coalitions that we have on proposition versus the big military bloc of NATO which they have on opposition. We have 2 points of model. The first is that with abolishment of NATO, we withdraw all troops, personnel, ships, whatever, from the conflict areas such as Afghanistan or whatever. Secondly, we tell you that we cancel the 1949 Washington Treaty, effectively ending the alliance, moving forward into a world of coalitions rather than big military blocs. Again, why is abolition necessary? For two reasons. Firstly, we say it's unlikely that we will regulate NATO or to have some kind of reform because of one, Article 10, which talks about unanimous voting, which we say it's likely that countries will not vote unanimously in abolition. But secondly, it's not likely to happen because in order for NATO to pursue their interests and purposes, they need to be on paper efficient. Thus, by abolition or by reforming, they do not meet their gains and their goals that they themselves set. There are three metrics or three criteria by which you judge the debate, dear panel. Firstly, it's whether NATO causes harm. Second is which side is more efficient in solving global conflict. And lastly, which side is better off at ensuring global peace. With this in mind, we move on to the first constructive, which will talk about how NATO is necessarily harmful in three layers. The first, we say that the 2% GDP or the military organization of NATO is already a huge burden on the economy, already a big harm, right? Because the 2% of GDP might not mean much to the big countries, it is a huge burden on the smaller countries, which are also a part of the NATO alliance. Secondly, you are obliged to buy American weapons, by which you arm yourself every year with new modern weapons. Not only that you have to buy and commit a huge amount of your GDP to the military cause, you also have to buy standardized equipment such as rifles with 5.56 caliber bullets, which is something that is standardized within NATO and something that countries need to shift to if they enter NATO or if they are a part of NATO. Lastly, it's about expensive training, right? Because huge military blocs required all the countries to participate in training, which takes a lot of resources because all of the countries need to be present, as well it harms the environment because it's done with huge militaries and it's already harmful because it's of all the expenses present. But the second layer in the first argument talks about how NATO is necessarily conflict-oriented. Why? Two reasons. The first is the big war industry present predominantly in the West, right? Because of the interest of the huge lobbying power and the huge power of money that inherently is present in the war industry, we say it's likely that the war industry will pressure NATO, and because it's a part of a military alliance, to pressure NATO into conflict areas or to be militaristically oriented. The second reason is American-US political imperialism, because it's in the interest of the United States, which is the predominant factor in NATO, to have their political interests globally met, which means that they likely take down governments which they do not approve of overseas. But then lastly, it disproportionately harms smaller countries within the alliance, right? Why? Because USA, with their 85% of funding within NATO, causes their interests to be met, right? They coerce countries into unanimously agreeing to interventions for two reasons. The first is the fact that they use soft power, such as denying aid or ending economic cooperation, using this as a threat to coerce countries into going into interventions. But Emmanuel has a point.
Exactly, smaller countries were the ones that benefited from intervention of NATO. Like the example of Baltic states, for instance, who were protected from Russian intervention.
You have to realize that a lot of smaller countries do not have the incentive of a conflict that happens overseas because they don't want their soldiers dying for a US imperialistic war in the Middle East, right? Notice that the comparative is, the side of the opposition will likely claim too that these countries are under threat. We shall analyze in the second argument how this is not the case. Smaller countries get pushed into conflicts and they are disproportionately harmed in comparative to Germany, UK, or the United States. Lastly, we give the example of Madrid bombings, which is the example of intervention of NATO in the Second Gulf War, when Madrid bombings, terrorist attacks happened simply because Spain was coerced into going into the war, and then retaliation of this terrorist group happened, which disproportionately hurt civilians of this country. This argument then again proves to you how, and this is all a part of the unique things of big military blocs, and with this argument we uniquely win the point of whether NATO causes harm. We say it causes a lot of harm. But with this in mind, we now move on to the second substantive, which will be about how ethical coalitions are necessarily better. Opposition will likely claim that there exists a threat from the East, for example, such as Russia, China, or other expansionist powers out there. We say to you, that might be true, but it's very important to recognize that predominantly Russia is a reactive power towards NATO aggression from the East. This happens because of 3 reasons. The first, because it happens, the huge rivalry and polarization happens, but more about that in the third argument, because there's a rivalry between Russia and the NATO on one hand. Secondly, it's simply because they can, right? Because they have so much military might, so they can push imperialistic interests, they can push NATO eastwards against Russia. And lastly, that because they violate the 1990 agreement, which acknowledged that the NATO will not spread toward the East, which NATO did not abide by, and effectively pushing NATO east, and therefore Russia is reactive. But notice, even if the side of the opposition throughout the debate proves to you that there in fact exists a threat from the East, we give you unique benefits from ethical coalitions that we necessarily support, right? But before that, we have one more layer of analysis, how exactly the nature of warfare has changed. Firstly, we say to you that cyber attacks are a predominant or a more increasing way of fighting warfare, right? Because in the 21st century, standing armies and military conflict is not how it goes anymore, right? Russia disabled and effectively destroyed the internet of Estonia for a single day, even though it was a reactive action. NATO has no mechanism, because they're a military power, to fight these type of attacks. The second nature of warfare is guerrilla tactics or terrorist attacks. No, thank you. Because notice that NATO supposedly was supposed to fight against like the Taliban or terrorist groups. But because they use so much different tactics, we cannot combat it with standing arms and with boots on the ground, right? Because terrorist attacks which happen on foreign or home soil in these countries, NATO has nothing to do against that. But then how are ethical coalitions better at solving these problems? We have 3 layers here. Firstly, because they are goal-oriented, right? Because they happen when a specific threat is present, so they specifically combat this threat, rather than NATO, which is always present and does nothing effectively. Secondly, we say that they do not waste money in pointless military trainings, or they do not waste money with the 2% of GDP, something that coalitions happen only in case the threat is there. But lastly, we tell you that they are not just bound to the West, right? They're just bound to Europe and North America, because any country which has the interest to intervene can intervene. But then lastly, we also tell you that NATO prevents the creation of ethical coalitions in the first place, because of 3 reasons. Firstly, because it financially does not pay off, right? Because at a point of which we are paying 2% of our GDP, we simply will not do another ad hoc coalition. Secondly, because they don't want to piss NATO off, they don't want to make America mad, and lastly, because they don't want to, they think they can count on NATO because they will come to their help. You vote for a solid proposition because we actively show that there is harm to NATO and how our solution is better. If you want world peace, no conflict proposition.
Thank you very much for that speech, Philip. And now to open the case for the opposition, let's give the floor to Emmanuel. Good luck.
Can you hear me? Yeah, right. Before we begin, like sort of Hannah inspired us, we would also like to congratulate or thank actually all of our coaches, as can be seen from the pictures there, including the ones that aren't there. So including Lucia and Sara, and also to our external mentor and professor Miklos for basically helping us reach this level. It's our final year, so thank you very much. A big round of applause for all of them, please. Yeah. Okay, so I would like to thank Philip for basically bringing us a very passionate speech. However, I do think that his speech was sort of out of touch with reality, right? Because I think that it rests on the premise that basically NATO is somehow an out-of-date organization, whereas they fail to basically consider all of the steps NATO has taken to modernize itself in order to meet the threats that are currently present in the status quo, right? So before I move on to the responses to side opposition, I would just like to characterize NATO and some of its main traits. So firstly, we think it's a defense-oriented alliance that basically has the goal of sustaining peace. This means that whatever intervention it goes into, it has a goal of basically maintaining peace within that country. Secondly, we also think that it offers a great diplomatic channel for all of the allied forces within NATO. This means that we can improve actually negotiation between allies and not only have some sort of external intervention mechanism that is actually beneficial. Now, onto side proposition, right? Because I think that they make a mistake when they say that the goal of, for their side actually, that the core of this debate is a comparative between ad hoc coalitions and whether or not they're effective and NATO. Because we think that as soon as they say that, they fail to establish a proper comparative as to why that is the case, they lose the debate. So first argument on their side about how NATO is inherently harmful. So first point they bring up is somehow related to economy and how expenses are great. We think that expenses are greater at the moment at which you are forced to buy military equipment yourself. If you're a small country who does not have the capacity to use all of the military tactics and weapons and so on that NATO does provide. It's exactly in the interest of smaller countries to be in NATO because it offers them protection, right? It's in the interest of Baltic countries to, for instance, be in NATO because it can prevent Russian intervention from basically impeding onto their sovereignty. We think that economy is something that's actually on our side because expenses are lower at the moment in which you have an allied, basically, channel of trade and so on. Secondly, about how it is conflict-oriented, right? And this is sort of contradictory to when they really want to point out about how one of the main articles of NATO is focused on authorization, right? Because they talk about how it's very likely that it will suddenly be like a slave to US imperialism and go into Russia and so on and antagonize other countries. Firstly, we think that if you have the defense mechanism where if not all countries literally authorize an attack, we believe it's unlikely to happen, right? Why would it be in your interest to authorize an attack or an intervention onto a country that you do not want to happen? Secondly, and this is also related to their second point about ad hoc coalitions, about US imperialism, right? Note that US imperialism is a thing that is far greater when you have ad hoc coalitions, because NATO is a system whereby all other countries keep the United States in check, right? It is a system whereby all of them had to consent to a specific operation in order for the United States to carry it out. Comparatively, ad hoc coalitions basically mean that the US can suddenly decide to basically intervene into another country and does not have this checks and balances systems in place. And this is important because this was exemplified via the Vilnius Agreement, right? Where the Eastern Bloc countries, even though they weren't part of NATO, conceded to America intervening into Iraq. We think this is something problematic because we don't have a proper way of stopping American intervention. It's worse on the side where they actually support ad hoc coalitions. And moving on to ad hoc coalitions, right, about this theory that Russia is actually reactive to NATO's aggression. False, right? Russia intervened into Crimea, and the problem was that Ukraine is not a member of NATO. If it were, it probably would have been protected from these forces. Comparatively, Baltic states are, and they can ask NATO to basically put the military on the ground and prevent Russian military intervention from happening there. Before I move on to the second point about modernization, sure.
Russia reacted afterwards. NATO implanted missile shields in Poland as well as expanding NATO towards east. It's a clear retaliation from NATO aggression.
Okay, right. We can obviously backtrack attention between the US and Russia and like NATO to the beginnings of the Cold War, right? But we don't think that this is something that can be used to justify every single action of Russia, right? It's its fault that it wanted to intervene into Crimea. It's its responsibility. It's our responsibility to help protect those states. So about how cyber attacks are now suddenly considered threats and so on, and we have to take adamant steps in order to prevent it. NATO already does this, right? NATO already considered this year or past year, whatever, that cyber attacks are considered a threat that is and should be solved by NATO, and it's also taking steps to implement like military training and programs in order to prevent it from doing so, right? In order to ensure that the society in which we live, the world in which we live, is more peaceful, and we think that NATO is to thank for that. Why? Firstly, this is our first argument about why efficient interventions are more likely when you have NATO. Now, the first point here is a capacity to intervene, right? PROP recognizes that we need sometimes to intervene into countries, right? Situations such as Kosovo. And we think that it is important that we have some sort of a organization that has the necessary size, the necessary infrastructure, the necessary training programs, whereby members of all countries, right, military, basically train together in order to carry out specific tactics and specific operations. This ensures that there's a quick mechanism in order to respond to any sort of tensions, to any sort of like things that could possibly be problematic and could possibly violate human rights. Again, the example of Kosovo, if NATO did not intervene, if there wasn't such a quick mechanism of doing so, a genocide would happen. We think that NATO has a capacity to prevent this as opposed to ad hoc coalitions which are quicker, which are more quickly formed and don't have like an established infrastructure and organizational element to it. Secondly, also importantly, is content, right? Because we think it's important that whenever you intervene into a country, that you basically carry out proper and sort of abide by human rights, right? We think that NATO is great in this because it does have mechanisms in place in order to prevent any sort of human rights violations from happening. Now, sure, the track record isn't exactly perfect. However, this is not the point, right? The point is that comparatively, ad hoc coalitions present a far greater risk of this actually happening than in NATO, where you have already an established diplomatic channel, established rules, established goals, basically organization that gains its legitimacy from abiding by them. Moving on to our second point about how it's actually more efficient at deterring interventions of countries such as Russia, of countries such as China. Now, an important stakeholder in this debate are exactly smaller, right, more irrelevant and more endangered countries. Like the Baltic states. We think that it's beneficial for them to have the support of the entire West on their side when they want to combat the infringement of Russia or of any other big actor, right? Because you have leverage once you literally can say, okay, our military is this big that if you do anything to these countries, you will be harmed. This is important, right? Because ad hoc coalitions do not carry the same amount of leverage, right? They're usually smaller, often carried out by one actor, and moreover, we think that it isn't such an efficient mechanism to basically deter these forces. Again, due to capacity, and also secondly, because of quite a great track record, honestly. So ultimately, we think that proposition loses this case on the grounds that they want to establish a comparative between efficiency of intervention. Obviously, it goes to opposition because NATO has the capacity to intervene and also has the content whereby it will abide by proper protocol. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that speech, Emmanuel. And now to continue the proposition case, let's give the floor to Aniket. Good luck.
Is this okay? Yeah? Okay, cool. Panel, for Emmanuel to claim that Phillips lives in a utopian world is kind of weird when they come up here and say that NATO is going to utopically solve all the problems in international relations that exist in status quo. Notice that NATO has been one of the most inefficient organizations of all time. Notice that NATO, that requires people to spend 2% of their GDP's main impact is deterrence against a possible war that they don't prove. On team proposition, we think that their impacts are marginal, but ad hoc coalitions, even in the cases when military intervention is necessary, is a unique mechanism in which we're able to do the very same things that NATO does even more effectively. 2 points of negation before moving on to reconstruction, and then my third argument, which is on the floor. Firstly, let's talk about intervention. When they come up here and talk to you about how it's important to sometimes have intervention because there are dictators and there are like oppressive regimes that exist. Firstly, their main nuance here is to say that NATO already has some sort of existing infrastructure and the ability to do so simply because it already has some presence in the international sphere. To which we say this is fundamentally not the case. Ad hoc coalitions have like their entire national armies that aren't distinct from their, like with NATO, their distinct from their actual armies. Here they have the entire armies that already exist, that can exist for intervention in and of itself. But furthermore, we think ad hoc is far more efficient at the point at which they have less bureaucracy in order to change something in the society. If they really want to stand by their idea of unanimous voting and how suddenly it's such a democratic institution, they also need to take the harm of having such an inefficient organization, because you have always one or two countries that won't agree with the idea. So their idea of intervention is not comparative, but it's also inefficient on their own metric. Secondly, let's talk about deterrence, right? Because this is currently their main characterization of how NATO is some sort of peacekeeping mission. Two things here. Firstly, we think that they need to prove to you that Russia would generally, in a world without NATO, attack countries willy-nilly. We don't think that's necessarily the case, because Russia just has an expansionist policy as a retaliatory policy to NATO's expansionism in Eastern Europe. That is all the arguments that Pauschek has talked to you about in first prop. So that is to say, we don't think that deterrence is needed in a world without NATO in the first place, because Russia is content by not being attacked on like every single front on a military presence. But secondly, we think that their type of deterrence doesn't work. At the end of the day, the nature of warfare is extremely different as it was during the Cold War. That is to say, things like cyber attacks, things like terrorism. NATO is extremely inefficient at solving these things because it doesn't have any infrastructure and necessary already manifesting things to do with this in the first place. We can see this when Russia completely crashed Estonia's entire internet, and Russia's response was nothing at all. What did Pauschek talk to you about in his first speech? He talked to you about, firstly, how this is an extremely big burden on the economy. That is to say, you have things like 2% of GDP being invested in NATO, and you also have things like training and buying arms from the USA. Furthermore, it's a democratic, it's a very bureaucratic institution that leads to inefficient things like inefficient interventions that they want to claim. Secondly, and crucially, that negates their characterization of being like a peacekeeping mission, is that it is uniquely conflict-oriented because of two structural reasons. Firstly, because the lobby of war is very, very rich and allows NATO, or encourages NATO to go in to intervene in different countries. But secondly, because US aims, I'm going to talk to you why they're the majority of the NATO institution in the first place, they directly want to have war in the first place and create some sort of disruption in the international sphere, so they're able to get their own economic leverage and their own economic gain from it. Thirdly, on the clash of small countries, right? They say that collective security exists and small countries are going to help. To which we say, firstly, collective security wouldn't be necessary in a world without NATO. But secondly, we say even if we're willing to trade that off for all the harms that come from small countries through not even subscribing to a war in Iraq, but still getting a terrorist attack in Madrid. That's exactly what happened to Spain. That's exactly what Pauschek talks to you about. We're willing to make that trade-off if it's extremely necessary. Okay. And then they come up here and say that US imperialism exists, and Pauschek gives you reasons why. But then Emmanuel thinks that, NATO keeps them in check because some sort of democratic institution. Okay, look, firstly, there's a difference from having some sort of democratic institution on paper and having it in practice, right? We think that the USA has enormous monopoly over what happens in NATO. But secondly, this is fundamentally not the case. We don't think the USA or other countries are likely to go rogue without NATO. Two reasons why. Firstly, they're extremely less powerful without the presence of Europe. Sure, Europe may be relatively insignificant, but it's a huge geographical area that has some sort of influence on NATO's ability to do army stuff. But secondly, because they're more scared from international condemnation, which means America is less likely to go randomly invading countries willy-nilly. Overall, because NATO is pro-conflict and doesn't actually solve any of the problems, Pauschek's argument still stands. But then he gives you a comparative about why ad hoc coalitions are necessarily better. He talks to you about how the nature of warfare has changed and how NATO has become obsolete at the point at which we need new institutions that are able to change something. They say reforms can happen, to which we say, firstly, there is no incentive to do that, as we've already talked to you about. And secondly, if there is an incentive to do that, why hasn't reforms already occurred? Cyber warfare has been around for a while. We don't understand why there was something to be done there. So how is ad hoc better uniquely? Firstly, it is goal-oriented. That is to say, there's certain specific problems that need to be fixed, which each country can specialize with existing infrastructure and money, rather than just have standing armies that are an extreme waste of money. Secondly, you have not only US interests, at the point at which ad hoc coalitions are a collaboration of different ideas and different viewpoints that it can include Eastern countries. You don't have unchecked power with the US. NATO prevents ad hoc proving that it's mutually exclusive, or at least very, very less likely for ad hoc coalitions to manifest. 3 reasons why. Firstly, because it's economically not viable, because you're already spending 2% of your GDP and you're already buying arms from America, you might as well be in NATO and you might as well not form ad hoc. Secondly, because it pisses off NATO and it makes them more angry. And thirdly, because countries believe that they can count on NATO to actually solve the problems that they're facing. No engagement from their side of the house. So overall, what Pauschek has proven to you still stands in this debate. NATO is still really inefficient organization, no matter what the utopic characterization of Emmanuel brings you, but also that ad hoc is a uniquely better mechanism to solve things. Third argument about how NATO uniquely polarizes for imperialist interests. Firstly, why does polarization happen? Firstly, there's only Western countries inside NATO. That includes the majority of Western Europe, a bit of Eastern Europe, and America, Canada, and Turkey randomly. Secondly, other countries feel threatened and retaliate normally. I'll prove to you later in a specific example of Russia, which is the main concept of this debate, that people, because they feel threatened and are being oppressed, the borders of NATO are moving closer and closer to Russia, they want to move outwards, which is a direct leading to their expansionist policy. Thirdly, it revives old issues. That is to say, the existence of NATO revives the issues of the Cold War that have already long gone, like 30 years ago. Fourthly, small states need to choose a side at the point in which they have big bloc of NATO and the supposed big bloc of Russia or the East or someone else. That means small states cannot live on their own. They need to choose a side. NATO uniquely polarizes this by the USA having a large amount of power. Firstly, the funding of NATO exists predominantly from the USA, which means they have a lot of leverage. Secondly, notice that since 1949, the establishment of NATO, every chairman of NATO was always from the US. They obviously have some sort of existence, like some sort of bureaucratic existence within the main ideas of power. That is to say, they feel entitled to exert this power through soft power, that is through coercion of countries to vote for them on these unanimous decisions that they want to push to you. Thirdly, because the majority of the training of soldiers exists by US generals who are already, who are the vast majority of the people or vast majority of the soldiers that are contributed, which means they're able to uniquely serve US interests. Uniquely, we think that Russia is one of the main examples for this, at the point at which there were a completely retaliatory mechanism of when Russia was feeling threatened and Russia therefore became expansionist. So because NATO is inefficient, because it polarizes the world, I'm very proud to propose.
Thank you very much, Aniket. Then we go back to the opposition to continue the opposition case. Good luck, Matthäus.
The problem with side of proposition today is that they are utterly confused about this motion. Because, in their first proposition speech, we hear how NATO is doing too much interventions, how countries are way too quick to intervene in the conflict areas, and then Aniket comes up here and says, oh, but because we are so ineffective, because we have, all members who have to consent to intervention happening in the first place. This is an inconsistency that they have to clear up in the third proposition speech. We, on the other side, tell you consistently that NATO is doing a just fine amount of interventions. We would actually like them more when there is a threat of a genocide happening. We would like them less when there is not, right? We tell you that those are not things inherent to NATO. Yes, we accept that there are some harms. We are ready to trade them off for all the benefits we bring to this table. And this is the problem with most of their negation. They don't actually engage with the reality out there. Because, for example, they have a whole point of analysis how NATO is preventing the building of ad hoc coalitions in the first place. Yeah. Great, we are fine with that. We want less ad hoc coalitions because we think ad hoc coalitions are bad. Why is this so? One, because they are less likely to respect human rights, brought to you by Emmanuel. Why is this so? Because you don't have Sweden in the same alliance as United States of America who starts telling you that you shouldn't kill farmers in Vietnam. We are telling you that you have other countries with which you have to negotiate for different benefits. For example, when Donald Trump comes to a NATO summit because he wants every single state to commit 2% of their GDP, which they don't want in status quo to the NATO budget, he has to give them something in exchange. This means that Donald Trump on our side of the house is less likely to become a rogue president who just bombs everyone who he doesn't like. On their side of the house, he's way more likely to do this because there are zero constraints attached to it. Because when he wants to bomb Iran, he can count on Saudi Arabia. When he wants to bomb Slovenia, for whatever reason, he can always count on our Croatian neighbors who don't like our borders in the first place. Those are the things that we are talking in this debate, and this is what they're failing to engage with. They fail to realize that on their side of the house, it's NATO, it's USA that is killing civilians, it's USA that is being the rogue state. Secondly, we tell you it's way less efficient because you don't have an alliance system which would have training in the first place. They come up here and tell us training is expensive. Well done, good research, right? We tell you that yes, this is expensive, but however, it's way better to have this than to actually have soldiers not knowing how to cooperate in the battlefield. When you had Operation Urgent, whatever was in Iraq, right, Desert Storm, it was a big problem because the Polish soldiers did not know how to communicate with the American soldiers in the first place. Different technologies which don't exist with NATO, which forces you to buy the same weapons because you're the same alliance, cannot cooperate on their side of the house. That's why they're unlikely to kill ISIS terrorists in their ad hoc coalitions. We are killing them. We like that. That's why we are winning this point. However, they tell us about how it's about conflict-oriented, how NATO is, provoking Russia and, doing all the bad things. Firstly, Crimea was invaded, then NATO sent troops to the Baltic states. They have to get the order of the event straight on the side of proposition. We are telling you that it's actually the Russia that is the aggressor and has been so for the last quite some decades. However, even if it's NATO the one who has done bad things that provoked Russia, what is the counterfactual on their side of the house? Just let them be there and don't do anything? No. Even if it's the NATO that is the reason that these things happen, they have happened in this status quo. We are debating the reality, and we believe that you should not leave the Baltic states just to Russia. Even if we caused it, we should protect the states who might suffer because of our actions. Because comparatively, on their side of the house, they are not protecting those who suffer from the actions of USA, because they get ad hoc coalitions who don't care about Baltic states because they're so small, because they don't have such an importance for the United States of America. Another point where they fail on the comparative they want to push on us. And their third argument about polarization, right? Let's deal with this somehow also. No, thank you. Firstly, we believe that this happens either way on both sides of the house. Polarization between Russia and the USA does not exist only in the last 20 years, it exists in the end of the World War II. Their interests are intertwined in certain countries, while on the others they are in direct conflict. Example, Syria. Russians want Bashar al-Assad there because it gives them airports, because it gives them oil. Americans don't because they want this oil for themselves. On their side of the house, polarization still happens. Those interests are still in conflict, but you have less ways of how to keep USA in check on their side of the house. That's why we are winning the polarization point. Secondly, we would prefer to actually have a block of states deciding about those actions. Look, because every single country have to say we are okay with invading certain country, we believe it's way less likely to actually escalate the tensions between Russia and USA. Why is this so? Because we don't think that Sweden and Finland and all of those countries that are near the border of Russia will actually want an open conflict with Russia. On their side of the house, when USA is a rogue state acting alone, they're doing this, they're attacking Russia directly because they simply don't care in the first place. Additionally, they never really engage with Emmanuel's analysis about small states which are protected on our side of the house. We tell you two things here. One, that it's cheaper for those states to be protected because they can pull in the common NATO budget and you get protection. Secondly, we believe it's very hard for Lithuania or Slovenia to get nukes to defend itself from their neighbors. NATO provides this for us exactly because you have USA in there. And when Donald Trump has to give concessions for us to fulfill our obligations, he's way more likely to care about us. He's way more likely to actually protect us in the first place. That's why they are losing the debate on their side of the house. Because we recognize, I will take in a second, that NATO does a lot of shit things, but comparatively it's better on our side of the house.
The comparative isn't that you have NATO or you have countries completely defenseless and to fend for themselves. You still have power dynamics in society. You're still able to have ad hoc.
Thank you very much, Aniket. Exactly. USA can still force Poland to invade Iraq. We don't see the difference here. We don't want USA to invade Iraq without the approval of other NATO members because we want these checks and balances. They're not engaging with our constructive. Third constructive, how we get less conflict between NATO members. As Aniket points out, NATO has a very weird member structure. For example, on one side you have Turkey, on the other side you have Greece. Right? We tell you that conflicts that will be way more likely to escalate without NATO being present are not escalating in the status quo. If we look in Greece and Turkey, right now we are having quite a migrant, well, I don't want to use this word, but problem there because, you know, migrants are trying to pass the border between Greece and Turkey. And it's a horrible humanitarian situation. Migrants are drowning in the Aegean Sea. We tell you that on our side of the house, the tensions between the two countries that right now exist because of the clashing interests are less likely to actually escalate because they're both members of the same alliance. Three structural reasons. Firstly, because they normatively acknowledge each other as allies. When you say that someone is your ally, you're unlikely to then escalate tomorrow and say, they're now enemies now, let's shoot them down. Secondly, we tell you that because those states have open diplomatic channels, it means that they know why their troops are moving along the border. They know what they're doing in their common missions. They know what their next moves are going to be. That is the unique benefit of NATO that they don't have on their side. Thirdly, we tell you there is more contact between other state leaders pressuring those same states to not escalate the conflict. For example, if Kosovo and Serbia were both members of NATO, we tell you that other members of NATO would not want an escalation of conflict between them. This is the comparative benefit, a unique benefit of NATO that we bring from our side of the house. Because peace between members has been assured since its creations. For all of those reasons, the only option today is opposition. So vote the government down. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mateusz. And now we go back to the proposition and we give the floor to Jiva. Good luck.
You're fucking tall, man. No organization time. Genuinely, I don't understand what Mateusz really wants to do with Russia at the point at which there's only cyber attacks with a military organization. I don't know how this deterrent is going to work with cyber attacks at the point at which there cannot be any reforms done due to the bureaucracy and due to the fact that America has no incentive in actually supporting these reforms at the point at which that would make them lose a lot of money, since a lot of the money is coming from, you know, NATO and a lot of like military power is going inside of there, and they don't have that sort of technology going into cyber attacks as well. So I'm pretty sure there is no incentive for reforms. So at the point of which Russia has a cyber attack, why would NATO actually retaliate with military attacks? Why would NATO retaliate with cyber attacks? I don't understand, since they have not provided a reason why reforms would actually happen. So, in my speech, I'll firstly go through, well, I'll mostly go through the clashes, but firstly, let's talk about negation. Their argument essentially said that at the point of which NATO would stop existing, then all of a sudden the countries inside of it, which are currently diplomatic allies that have the same interest in the global politics, that have similar interests in a lot of other things, start a war. So, like, let me break that down. Firstly, the first reason why I don't believe that is so is because the shift in power dynamics has not shifted towards military in the past few years, but rather in, what? rather into economic spheres. That is to say, a lot of people don't have the incentive to go into war, rather they have an incentive towards economic benefits. Exclusively because of NATO's existence, as other things such as the European Union, no thank you, there has been an increase in economic entanglement, and thus I do not believe that the countries that are currently in NATO would be actually willing to go into, military conflict, because that would mutually harm them in the future. So essentially what I'm saying is I don't think that argument is viable in the first place. Okay, let's go through the clashes. Firstly, let's talk about the main thing that NATO is currently doing, which is the deterrent, which is essentially the claim from side of opposition is that people are afraid to attack because NATO is going to come and the big bad USA is going to kill them. So first response to that has been given from first response, which is essentially that this is not efficient in modern day attacks, which is also part of my intro. Talking about cyber attacks and terrorism is simply not working. And this is the current shift into power dynamics from the military. And I don't think it's going to change in the future because mutual destruction is going to happen regardless. Why? So on the other hand, no, thank you. It's not like the only reason why countries don't attack is because they're afraid, but rather, like I said, because of the economic entanglement. But further, because they have much less to gain. But lastly, the fact that there's still a deterrent on our side of the house still stands. Because even if that's not true, even if economic entanglement is not the reason why Russia is currently not attacking a lot of European countries, and why I don't know, Croatians are able to be here without us being at war, is still the fact that because of the diplomacy and economic relationships that currently exist in our countries. No, thank you. Okay, so the whole deterrent point, I'm pretty sure, falls at this point. Let's talk about US imperialism. So essentially what they say is that USA and many other countries would go rogue without NATO, which is because there's not going to be a checks and balances argument. First response to that is that the USA does not have to act within NATO with every single conflict. So the fact is that on their side of the house they can still do this regardless, but it's not like NATO is going to stop them completely. Secondly, the fact that NATO exists is giving them unique access to countries. That is to say, they're giving them training fields, they're giving them soldiers, they're giving them options to train, which makes them extremely more powerful. Further on, they're giving them the ability to put certain weapons in certain parts, like countries, like space, and a lot of other things. Further on, why the US imperialism is not going to happen on our side of the house, because of that. Firstly, because the USA is actually more accountable comparably to NATO, because at the end of the day, when USA attacks, it's going to look like USA attacking. When NATO attacks, it's going to look like USA attacking alongside with the entire European Union and many other countries. So the difference here that when other people are going to condemn these people, they're way more likely to be condemning the USA rather than NATO. Why? Because NATO is seen as more legitimate than USA. The reason why, further on, US is not going to attack further is exactly because they need the support of other countries. They need support from the European Union, no thank you, in the international diplomacy. And that is the reason why they on their own are not going to attack. But with NATO, they can pressure other countries into going forward their agenda and actually pressuring them into submission, no thank you. So essentially, the comparative here is clear. Okay, cool. Let's talk about ad hoc coalitions on a comparative. I'll have to pick up that paper later on. Hopefully I'll remember. Okay, let's talk about ad hoc coalitions. So on a comparative, we are very likely to believe that ad hoc coalitions would form at the point at which there's going to be a conflict. Why? Because the countries around, and other countries are countries in general currently have a lot of diplomatic relations and comparatively to the past. No, thank you. So a lot of people have a lot of interest in other countries, that is to say economic interest and other forms of interest. So essentially, ad hoc coalitions will form if NATO does not exist. Currently, they don't form simply because they're not seen as viable in an economic scale, but also they're not seen as the best response since NATO already exists. So a lot of people turn to NATO rather than asking other countries around them, even though they would be a better response. Why would they be a better response? Simply because they would be goal-oriented, simply because they wouldn't be wasting money for a lot of research that is outside of NATO. So that is to say they would be wasting... Okay, sure. Like, the difference here is that USA still needs legitimacy on our side of the house. There's still incentive to have this legitimacy, so they will not be acting whatsoever, whilst NATO is giving them the option to go into these countries with said legitimacy, because they're pressuring these countries into submission, because otherwise, like the fact is that NATO is going to be a pressure system for the US to go into other countries and attack. Without this, we're actually, we're changing the narrative in which they are. Like, the marginal change that we're currently having is that NATO is not going to be imperialistic, like, just to be clear. Okay, cool, let's talk about actual coalitions. This is the actual class that I was talking about in the first place. Okay. Like I said, they're goal-oriented, so they will be placing specific money only in specific cases, and they only the people that are going to have interest are going to intervene, regardless on which side of the political spectrum they are. That is to say, whether they're Western or Eastern countries in the first place. This gives you the option for countries that are in current political opposition to each other, based on NATO, to actually cooperate and actually come to better conclusions. Simply because other countries are better in certain wars. For example, if you have a war specific in the desert, a lot of countries that would have the ability to work specifically would actually be able to do that. So then there is the issue of less likely to respect human rights. The difference here is that ad hoc coalitions are more likely to be accountable simply because they're smaller and because they don't have the legitimacy of NATO behind them. So essentially, whatever NATO supports, the international community will support regardless. Further on, I don't think anyone here believes that NATO has an amazing human rights violation record. So I don't think on a comparative that even is true, that NATO is accountable to human rights violations, because they obviously don't care about human rights. So for the reason why I don't think NATO can actually form a cohesive government, and we need some sort of economic cooperation which is deformed by NATO, because simply it creates a polarization in this world, please vote proposition.
Thank you very much, Shiva. And now for the last constructive speech of this debate, let's give the floor to Emma. Good luck.
There is an international threat for military conflict, and it's not just from Russia, which, by the way, is a state which breaches state sovereignty and annexes the entire region, but it's also from other outbursts, from regional conflicts, from Taliban and ISIS. We think that smaller countries are also at risk here, and we are very proud to be on the side of the House which provides mutual security for this country, as well as the only side which has the capacities to prevent these conflicts from escalating. So, 3 points in my speech. Firstly, about whether we bring about, which side of the House brings about more conflicts and worse outcomes. Secondly, where do we get more effective intervention when we need it? And thirdly, how do we combat the US's imperialism? So firstly, about how NATO is conflict-oriented, because the main impact that of proposition gives to us is, look, these countries are forced to spend a lot of money, a lot of GDP to militarize themselves, and thus this creates more conflict and more polarization or whatsoever. Firstly, we tell these countries consensually make a trade-off, because sometimes these countries aren't geostrategically important for USA to intervene on behalf of them under their coalition, ad hoc coalitions alternative, right? And we think that it's very crucial that every country which doesn't have itself the capacities to protect itself, to have this mutual security, which is only possible under NATO when your allies are entitled to protecting you when you're under attack. Secondly, we don't recognize what exactly is the impact here, right? Because they only say, look, the world will be more polarized, and because Russia is retaliating to NATO's military hostility, but we tell you that Russia is the one who actually annexed a different country and intervenes in democratic elections, right? We think that it is very important that we have a deterrence, and which is preventing Russia from doing so in the Baltic region as well, at the point at which it already expressed that it has an aggressive foreign policy. Thirdly, we tell that we actually give these countries in the Baltic state leverage power over Russia and these other actors, because we can deter her from annexing other regions as well, and furthermore, we think that it is justified at the point at which Russia has already expressed
expressive foreign policy. Second point here about the argument Mateusz gave to you and set of proposition never responded to you, right? Because we told you that if we don't have NATO, there's likely to be even more conflicts between the allied countries within NATO. Why? Because some countries have different conflicts among themselves, right? We give you the example of Turkey and Greece right now, which have a migrant crisis and problem going on and need to solve it. We tell you that under being these countries being NATO allies, we're much more effective in solving this diplomatically because either they have pressure from other allied countries to not talk about it, to not escalate this militarily in hostility, but also because they're already like part of NATO, because they're already allied countries who share borders and who also have common interests, and they also have intake about their military capacities and so on. Sure.
There is a unique incentive of NATO to go to war at the point in which it's pro-conflict and for profit in the first place.
The thing is, they never proved to us why exactly would NATO be pro-conflict. We told you that it gives mutual security to countries who aren't of geostrategical importance. The only impact they had about NATO being pro-conflict is that it's effectively a USS bitch, right? But we think that it is not that this is going to be happening either way, and we think that we're more effective in containing USA, but this will be talked about in my clash later on. Second clash about when do we actually have effective interventions, right? So we think that, again, sometimes we do in fact need to intervene in certain countries. We do in fact need to intervene in Kosovo, for example, before a genocide happens. And the set of proposition gave us an alternative. They said, look, we're going to have ad hoc coalitions which are going to be equally effective, but they won't be such as like long-term commitment as NATO is, right? We tell you this specific alternative is not as effective because it's much more spontaneous, it's much more reactionary, and it takes a lot more time. We think that it is much more likely for USA to use the power of momentum to intervene and look for legitimacy, for example, look in Iraq. Secondly, we think that we are much more effective because we actually have a standby NATO military alliance, right? Because we think that NATO constantly develops military strategies with which to intervene, because it constantly has capacities with which to intervene, which means that when a conflict happens, we're much more effective if intervening quicker and going there before something happens. Again, example, the Kosovo. On comparative, ad hoc coalitions have to go a lot through a lot more diplomatic means to have to gather their capacities in order to intervene. We think that this is a unique characteristic that NATO brings to the House, is that it actually has standby military strategies and military capacities which with to intervene. But secondly, they said that NATO is ineffective because it's an old organization and it doesn't modernize and so on, right? We think that if the state of warfare has changed to cyber attacks and other type of warfare or whatever, then it's actually good that we have an alliance which constantly looks for new strategies and new capacities and new ways through which it can actually create. Under the side of the House, ad hoc coalitions are going to be much less effective at modernizing warfare because they will only be reactionary when the conflict already happens. Under our side of the House, we constantly develop, we have annual summits where the ministers of the defense have to talk to each other and talk about how the different strategies of defense can actually happen. Furthermore, we actually told you that NATO already considers cyber attacks as a ground for its warfare. We think that this actually effectively proves how it is actually modernizing within times and within new military conflicts. Third clash then about US's imperialism, right? Because they themselves tell you that US is likely to have to use NATO as a tool of its aggressive foreign policy and use it for militaristic purposes. Again, why does that change under the side of the House? No, that is more likely to be much worse, because under the side of the House, US will not have the legitimacy of NATO to intervene, and thus we're less likely to deter it from intervening, but rather it will go by itself, looking for 3 countries to create an ad hoc coalition and intervene. On the other side of the House, you have to go through getting a unanimous mode from 29 allies. Second of all, you think that at the point at which USA would want to convince NATO to intervene, it has to convince a lot more people to go to it and a lot more people to respond, and so on. We think that effectively the world will be much more polarized when the US is alone and the only actor which is affecting. And when I talk about how Russia is seeing NATO as a US tool of foreign policy, right? And we think that it is much worse when you have only US and certain ad hoc coalitions, and and so on, right? Secondly, we think that NATO within itself capacities has a lot more diplomatic relations and a lot more diplomatic channels. Thus, it is likely to prevent sort of these things from happening at the point to which you have more of these capacities already in place, already developed, already taken into account, and already taken standby, and not only going into ad hoc coalitions, only reactionary responding to certain conflicts. At the end of the speech, why would we start of opposition today? Firstly, because we tell you that the trade-off that these countries are making is actually providing mutual security to countries which don't have the capacities to protect themselves from foreign interventions. Secondly, because we tell you that under this side of the house, you're more likely to get more conflicts when you have allies which now have the capacities to be and pressure from other NATO allies to not create further conflicts. Thirdly, because we told you that we are much more effective in interventions because we already have developing strategies and we're modernizing them through time. And thirdly, because we're actually keeping the US in check, because we're actually, we have to convince more people in order to get an intervention. We're very happy to oppose.
Thank you very much, Emma. Then we stay with the opposition and we give the floor to the reply speaker of Team Opposition, Emmanuel. Good luck.
Okay, like, can you hear me well? Because I'm not good with mics. Yeah? Yeah? Okay, cool. So I think that a lot about international relations can be compared with a classroom setting, right? And this analogy was already used by my friend, but I think it's very applicable. Let's say that we have the USA, and let's say it's very similar to a 7-foot jock, right, who's playing football and is very popular in school, right? And then you have a group of geeks who are good at doing homework and good at studying and making notes, right? And they basically are fighting against another group of individuals, right? We think it's beneficial if you can trade some of your notes and so on with the jock in order for that jock to help you beat the other people, right? I think it's, I mean, I know, right? Neither of the sides really likes what America is doing, but we do think that if you have some sort of negotiative mechanism in place, it's easier to keep it in check, and at the same time you get quality interventions, you get interventions that actually have proper content, that abide by human rights, and basically prevent conflict, especially when it comes to smaller countries. And those will be my 3 points. Firstly, on intervention, secondly, on conflict, and lastly, on how we actually protect smaller countries. So when it comes to intervention, it's, I think, quite good for side proposition, and great for us actually, to set up the debate based on a comparative of where do we get better interventions. We say NATO, absolutely, right? Firstly, because it helps, as we've mentioned, keep the United States in check, right? If that's really a problem they're trying to characterize as being so big, we think it's better if you have a lot of countries that can say, no, we do not agree with the policies, we do not agree with the specific intervention that you want to pass. Comparatively, there's far less checks and balances in place if you actually don't have NATO, right? We think that the US is actually more likely to care about its reputation when it is part of NATO than when it is not. Secondly, we think we offer quicker mechanisms for intervening. Cases such as Kosovo, where it is really, really important to intervene quickly, wouldn't happen if they would meet up 1 week before and say, okay, we need to do something about it, right? Something the proposition wants to do. Also, what's important here is cooperation. It's far better if you have common training, right, where all of the military and all of the soldiers actually can communicate with each other, can actually carry out those operations efficiently, have a common goal in mind. Sure, you set up a goal when you have ad hoc coalitions, but it's far less. But you're far less efficient at seeking out and actualizing that goal. Moreover, we think that NATO has the capacity to modernize, meaning all of the threats that they name about cyber attacks and so on. It's better if you already have a set infrastructure in place, a set channel of dialogue, and so on. Lastly, very importantly, about human rights, right? Obviously, whenever there's an intervention in place, there's a high risk of lives being lost. We think that any organization has to legitimize its existence, right? And NATO is based on some fundamental principles. Principles of keeping peace, principles of actually adhering to human rights. It's more likely to follow that than if you have a rogue state like the US or whatever going into a country without any specific mechanism and principle behind it. And when they talk about conflict and so on, we think that on one level, defense alliance is a defense alliance, meaning that it's unlikely to like prosecute a specific actor like Russia, and also if it does, it's like Russia's fault because their actions are abhorrent and should be prosecuted. Secondly, importantly, never responded to by their side, we think it's beneficial because you get less tension, less likelihood for conflict between allies, right? It's better that Greece and Turkey are in NATO than if they weren't be, because conflicts would likely to escalate. We don't want that. But lastly, the most important stakeholder of the debate, what actually happens to smaller countries, right? Which is something they try to ignore on their side. We say two things. Firstly, it's in their interests and they give their consent to be part of NATO because it gives them a capacity to protect themselves. It's economically less expensive if you already have an organization that provides military, soldiers, weapons, and so on in order to defend against a specific actor. And moreover, if it's the combined forces of the West, it's even more likely to deter. Vote up.
Thank you very much for that speech, Emmanuel. And now to conclude this high-level debate and give the last speech of this tournament, let's give the floor to Aniket. Good luck.
Again. Using Emmanuel's same analogy, there are two worlds in this debate. There's the world of opposition, which is the nerd who thinks that everything is by the book and everything that is on paper actually manifests in the real world. And then there's the world of proposition, which we understand the street smarts of society and actually understand how things work in the international scale. That is the comparative in this debate. That is why you vote for proposition. We're the ones who actually make change in society. Let's look at their case, or let's look at this debate through four distinct points. Firstly, polarization. They say two things practically. Firstly, that you can have democratic discussion and people voluntarily go into these countries in the first place. We say, directly clashing with our polarization argument, that you don't really have a choice to do this in the first place, because small states are inherently coerced into going into one of the two big blocks, because you have to choose a side. They don't clash with this. And furthermore, we say that polarization has other negative externalities. That is to say, you are more likely to have wars because you have less economic entanglement and political meetings. Secondly, let's talk about ad hoc coalitions, because at the end of the day, this debate has become more or less dissing NATO if it's good or bad, without actually looking at the comparative. The only response to our case about ad hoc coalitions is that it takes a lot of time. To which we say, no, it doesn't, because or even if it does, your comparative is NATO, which is the most bureaucratic organization of all time. Like, I've never heard of an organization that needs a unanimous vote in order to pass literally any tiny intervention in any country. If they really want to claim efficiency of interventions, they really side on ad hoc coalitions where we actually realize where you're supposed to intervene. Like, really, what's more believable? That you come up with a strategy and you take time to come up with military strategy, or that you unanimously first decide whether to intervene or not and then debate about that and then come up with a strategy to solve things? I'd vote proposition on that as well. Let's look at the deterrent point, because at this point, NATO has become, with spending 2% of GDP in every country, practically a deterrent mechanism, to which they say Article 5, mutual assured destruction, nuclear weapons, yay. Three responses we give you continuously throughout the bench. Firstly, the nature of warfare has inherently changed, and we need a different coalition or temporary coalitions in order to fix this. Things like cyber wars require computers, not troops on the ground. Secondly, we don't think that deterrent is needed in a world without NATO in the first place. As I've shown you, and as Pauszek has also talked about in very first prop, the reason why Russia and other such countries are expansionist is because it's a retaliatory mechanism for the economic pressures that are being put on their country as a whole, but also because they want to gain back the territory that they lost during the fall of the communism and fall of the Cold War, etc. Thirdly, we talk to you about they need to prove to you for their deterrent to stand that Russia would be inherently pro-invasion and randomly attack countries willy-nilly if not NATO didn't exist. They don't prove to you the inherent incentive of Russia to do so, which is why they don't prove why a deterrent is necessary and why it's effective. Secondly, let's talk about the rogue USA. That's basically what Emma talked to you about in the majority of her speech. Okay, they say that it's not possible because you have a unanimous vote with NATO, which means you have higher checks and balances. To which we say, again, there's a difference between a unanimous unanimous vote on paper and a unanimous vote in reality. We give you 3 structural reasons why the USA has a complete monopoly over the NATO voting system, which means it's far more likely to serve US interests. So then the comparative in this debate becomes, you have a USA that's rogue and interventionist, or you have a USA that's rogue and interventionist under the name of NATO. That is then the comparative in this debate. And why is their side worse? Because their side only serves US interests, with the entirety of Europe needing to have to obligatorily going along with these things. We show you how this has negative externalities for small states, as is Phillips' argument, no engagement. But furthermore, we say inherently it means that small states are being bullied by the jocks on their side of the house. At the end of the day, because NATO is ineffective and obsolete, because it's counterproductive for the very people it wants to help, and because it's principally reprehensible, I'm very proud to oppose, and I beg you to do the same. Propose.
So please give one more round of applause for all debaters in the final.
In the name of National Debate Organization and the school, I thank both of the teams for making it to the finals and presenting us this great debate. Judges will now go out to discuss and come up with a decision, and we are going to do the award ceremony. I would really like to say that from a position of somebody who is working on a development of a national debate program, it was really brilliant to see 2 Slovenian teams, 2 Slovenian schools making it to the finals. So also in my name, congrats and thanks not just to the coaches, university students who are helping, but also to the Slovenian schools for creating such an intellectually inspiring and challenging environment for the debaters and debate clubs that then produce such brilliant young minds. And also, as somebody who is coaching national debate team, I'm sure we're going to do great this year. Now at the beginning of this tournament, I said that I believe that this tournament is special because it's decentralized, because it's not just something that we make happen in a capital city, but also somewhere outside, like the main centers. I said that it's special because it's a proof of a long, 18 years long cooperation between National Debate Organization and school, hosting school. But the third reason that I mentioned, why I really like this event and this tournament, is that each year we bring back one of our former students, former debaters who are now studying abroad. We bring them back so that they act as chief adjudicators, that they help us with judging, with educating judges, with making the decisions. And I'm really pleased and happy and honored to invite Sarah Berning, one of our chief adjudicators and former students, to proceed with the award ceremony and to announce who are the best speakers, best teams. So Sarah, the stage is yours. We are waiting for the results.
Thank you, Miha. Thank you, everybody, for coming. This was so fun. So now we're going to announce, basically give these plaquettes to people who got to quarterfinals and to everybody else, also for the 10 best speakers and for the teams in the final, so whoever won it. So for the quarterfinalists, the first team that got to quarterfinals was Grofje Celski. I think they left already. Oh, there you are. Just come downstairs.
Yeah, just come.
Then we have Croatia B. And Croatia A2. And last but not least, it was Logos Emerald. It's Croatia. Oh, sorry. Next, we have semi-finalists. Firstly, Redwoods. And secondly, Poliana A. Next, we have top 10 speakers. In 10th place, we have Nika Tavar. Ninth best speaker is Gabriela Papet. Eighth best speaker is Yana Ushen. Seventh best speaker is Mislav Mikota. Sixth best speaker is Damian Pavlicevic. And for the fifth best speaker of this tournament is Emma Jagar. Fourth best speaker is Emmanuel Krantz. Third best speaker is Filip Paušek. And the second best speaker is Aniket Godbo.
Okay, now only two more announcements. The best speaker of the tournament and the winning team. I see our judges are back. I do have a award and the name of the best speaker, but I would like to invite now a colleague, Milan Bergles, to join us at the podium to give the award for the best speaker and the best team. So, it's my big pleasure to announce the best speaker of 18th edition of the International Debate Tournament Ljutomer 2020 edition, Mateusz Rezman-Tasić. And now, one last decision we need to hear about. It was already made. We just need the info on it. So I invite another chief adjudicator, Devin, who was also a chair judge, main judge in the finals at the panel, to explain us what happened and how did the judges decide.
So teams, thank you very much again for what was a very good debate. I will try to do it as brief as possible, but still I have to build some suspense because that's part of a final score. So in the end, it was a split decision, meaning that some judges voted for the proposition and some judges voted for the opposition. The judges that voted for the proposition felt like the proposition set up a very clear debate from the start. It was very clear that the comparative in this debate was either having ad hoc coalitions or being supported by NATO. The part of the panel that felt like the proposition won told us that there was not enough engagement from the opposition side on A, why that comparative would not work, and B, why the incentives of the US would not make sure that they could exercise their power. On the other hand, the other part of the panel felt that opposition did a slightly better job in a few ways. A, they felt like the opposition did a better job in actually asking some very important questions on whether that counterfactual would ever actually come into existence. So will we get ad hoc coalitions, yes or no? And according to that part of the panel, they were able to create some serious doubt about even if we get ad hoc coalitions, would these then be better or not? So in the end, it was a 6-1 decision. And the team that won is a team that like shows that when you are down, you can get back up. And if you lose the final 1 year, you can come back and win the final the next year. So it went to team opposition. So, and to take some pictures, but also to get the round of applause that they definitely deserve, please come to the front, Team Bejigrad A. Anna.
For political reasons, I don't want to reveal the comment colleague Bergles just made. But this is the end where we really need to do one more thing. We need to give one grand applause for the school, for all the people who made this tournament possible. So thank you very much, everybody who are working on that. With this, we would like to conclude with this tournament. Of course, all the photo opportunities with the winners, with the chief adjudicators, if you will. Now's your chance. I do believe that there is one final announcement also from the person who opened this tournament, from the National Debate Organization. Thank you very much, and I hope I can say also in the name of school, see you next year.
Okay, so as I told at the, I don't know, Utvuritav, we will announce the winner of #IDTL 2020 winner. And the winner is Banja Luka. Please join us down here on the stage.
It's okay. So we'll divide it. It's okay.
You're dividing.
We'll do it one at a time.